Okay, so we're going to talk about simplifying radicals. That's our next topic. And the key word here is probably the word simplify, because you've seen that word a lot of times before, and maybe the first time you were introduced to it was during fractions. So this is going to take a similar meaning, except now we're going to be talking about radical signs and square roots. So right here we have this phenomenal math term here. It's called radical 20, which is how we really would probably refer to this, but what it means is the square root of 20. So back in the day in 6th grade you learned about perfect squares, and you probably remember a few of them. Some of them are 4, 9, 16, so on and so forth. So this is finding the square root of 20. Your calculator is equipped to give you this value if you wanted it. There's a square root symbol in blue right here, and so to use it you would hit second and you hit the x squared button, and it'll pull up this radical sign. Now you could just type in 20 and then you hit enter or equals, and it's going to give you a value of 4.47213595, which is great, but the problem with that is I'm not looking for the value of it, I'm looking for you to simplify it. So when you're simplifying a radical, and we'll keep this in here just because this will be useful later, but when we simplify a radical, what we're actually trying to do is we're trying to break the number that's inside down into two numbers that would multiply. So it's like factoring. So if I look at this, I am going to break this down into the square root of 4 and the square root of 5. Now you have to keep the symbol there, the radical sign, but if you just look at the numbers alone, 4 times 5 is 20, so that's what I did, I factored it. Now, you can choose other numbers, but the numbers that you want to choose should be one of your perfect squares. So here's your list of perfect squares. And if I look at all the things that multiply to 20, there's 1 times 20, there's 2 times 10, and then there's 4 times 5. Now, this is your perfect square chart. And for all arguments here, this is something that you should kind of memorize. You're supposed to have memorized it a long time ago, but if you didn't, it's okay. You can make this chart over again, and you now have one in your possession. If you look at all of your perfect squares, they're in the middle here, and these are the square roots of those perfect squares. So 1 is a perfect square, because 1 times 1 is 1, and the square root of 1 is 1. 4 is a perfect square because 2 times 2 is 4, so the square root of 4 is 2. When we're looking to break our radical down into two numbers, we're trying to choose the largest number that is a perfect square. Now 20 is the largest number, but it's not a perfect square. The largest perfect square and the only perfect square in here is 4, so I'm going to choose radical 4 and 5. This isn't a perfect square, but the 4 is. So this simplifies to be 2, because the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of 4 is 2. And since the radical 5 can't simplify, that's just going to stay till the very end, and that's your answer. Now, here's how you can check it. Okay, it's not foolproof, but it works. When we talked about doing this in the beginning, we said we're simplifying, and when you simplify, you aren't changing the value, you're just changing the way it looks. For example, if I were to write 2 over 4, that would simplify to 1/2. Now they're the same thing, but this is the more simplified version of that. Now if you were to actually convert these to decimals or use your calculator to find out what the value of 2 over 4 was, it would be 0.5. Now if you were to do that same thing with the 1/2, you would also get 0.5. So the value isn't changing, but the appearance is. So we can use that same logic here with radicals. Radical 20 is 4.47213595. Now you don't have to memorize that, but that is the value of radical 20. Now if we're going to simplify radical 20 and we end up with 2 radical 5, then we should be able to type this in and it should give us the same answer, because we're not changing the value, we're just simplifying the way it looks. So if you type that in as 2 radical 5 and you hit enter, you get the exact same number. So that's a good way for you to check when you think you're done Alright, another good way to check is you look inside the radical and you think, can this be broken down into the product of two numbers, one of which is a perfect square? Can we do the same thing that we did when we broke down 20 into 4 and 5, and 4 being a perfect square? And you can't do it with 5, because the only numbers that 5 will break down to is 1 and 5, and if it's 1 is the best perfect square you have, you can't do anything else with it. So we're going to go over here and we're going to break this down into two numbers that multiply to 80. Now you're trying to choose the number that is the largest perfect square. So if you think about all of the things, all of the factors of 80, I'll write them out. There's 1 and 80. There's 2 and 40. There's 4 and 20. There's 5 and, let me see, 5 and 16. Let's see, 6, no, 7, 8, 8 and 10. And that's it. Now, if you were to look at all of these multiply to 80, if you were to look through here and you were to try to find the largest perfect square, and you compare it with your perfect square's number, 1 is always going to be there, but you're never going to use it because it won't help you simplify. 4 is a perfect square, and 16 is a perfect square. So 16 is the biggest one. So what I like to do is I like to put the perfect square in the first radical and the other number that's not a perfect square into the second radical. So we're using 5 and 16. So these are the two numbers that we'll use that multiply to 80. The perfect square we'll put over here, and the non-perfect square will go over there. And then we know that the square root of 16 is 4, so this will be 4 radical 5. And that's it. Now you can check this out. If I clear this out and I do radical 80, I get 8.944 and all that jazz. And now if I check my answer, I should get the same thing, and I do, which is a good way to check it. Moving on to the last one here. If I'm going to break down 50 into two numbers that multiply to 50, and one of them being a perfect square, the largest one that I could think of, that would be 25 and 2. So radical 25 and radical 2. Radical 25, or the square root of 25, is really just 5. So your answer is 5 radical 2. And you can check it here. Radical 50 is going to be 7.07, and 5 radical 2 is the same thing. So there you go. Give that a shot, see how you feel about it.